The war in Europe had ended not with silence, but with movement. In the spring of 1945, trains ran in reverse of their former purpose, carrying men not toward the front but away from it. Columns of prisoners moved through shattered towns and fields stripped bare by years of fighting. Flags had been lowered, uniforms altered, insignia removed or torn away. The great machinery of conquest had come to rest, and in its wake stood tens of thousands of German officers waiting to discover what kind of future followed defeat. Among them were generals, men accustomed to command, ceremony and certainty, now reduced to numbers, escorted by soldiers younger than many of their own sons. Publicly, the war ended with celebration. In London and New York, crowds filled the streets. Bells rang. Newspapers printed photographs of surrender documents and smiling leaders. The story told to the world was one of triumph and closure, of justice finally delivered after years of destruction. But far from the cameras and parades, in enclosed compounds across Europe and later across the Atlantic, another reality unfolded quietly. There, beyond the reach of applause, German generals waited. They waited not only for judgment, but for an understanding of what kind of judgment awaited them. Many had prepared themselves for the worst. In the final months of the Reich, rumors had spread quickly through the officer corps, of summary executions, of retribution without trial, of revenge administered by those who had suffered under German occupation. The men who surrendered did so with rigid formality, some still wearing medals, others stripped of all insignia, but nearly all expecting humiliation or death. The language of their diaries and private letters, when they dared to write, reflected this expectation. They spoke of fate, of reckoning, of punishment long delayed. What they encountered instead was something more difficult to comprehend. The camps were not uniform. Some were converted military bases, others hastily assembled enclosures bordered by wire and guard towers. Yet within these places, the routines that emerged were marked by order rather than chaos. Prisoners were registered, counted, issued blankets and rations. The food was plain but consistent. The guards, many of them American reservists or recent recruits, carried out their duties with an air that was neither vengeful nor familiar. Commands were given calmly. Infractions were noted, not punished publicly. There were rules and the rules were followed. For the captured generals, this was deeply disorienting. Accustomed to hierarchies in which power was displayed and enforced through severity, they struggled to interpret restraint. Some suspected deception, a calculated pause before retribution. Others saw in the formality a deliberate humiliation, a reminder that authority had passed irreversibly from their hands. In private conversations, they spoke of waiting, of being held in suspension between what had been lost and what had not yet been imposed. Days followed a strict rhythm. Morning inspections. Meals eaten in silence or in low murmurs. Time for walking, for writing, for staring through wire at landscapes that bore no resemblance to the ones they had known. The absence of chaos was, for many, the most unsettling aspect. In the quiet, memory intruded. The absence of shouting left room for recollection. The measured tone of their captors left space for thoughts that had long been suppressed by urgency and command. The Americans observed all of this with a mixture of professionalism and unease. Many had grown up with images of German officers as embodiments of menace and discipline. Now they found themselves guarding men who, stripped of authority, appeared older, thinner, and uncertain. Some guards noted how carefully the prisoners maintained their posture, how they continued to address one another by rank even when rank no longer carried power. Others noticed moments of vulnerability, a tremor in the hands, a pause before answering a simple question, that unsettled preconceived notions of the enemy. Officially, the camps were models of compliance with international law. Inspections were conducted. Reports were filed. The language of legality framed every interaction. Yet beneath this administrative order ran an undercurrent of psychological strain. The prisoners were not being punished in the way they had expected, and that absence became its own form of pressure. There was no clear boundary between guilt and survival, no visible endpoint to the waiting. At night, in the confined stillness of barracks, the men listened to unfamiliar sounds. The distant hum of vehicles, the wind moving across open ground, the occasional voice of a guard speaking casually in a foreign tongue. These sounds replaced the roar of artillery and the barked commands of the front. For some, the quiet was unbearable. It invited reflection on decisions made, orders given, lives altered or ended. For others, it offered a fragile reprieve, a chance to exist without immediate demand. The paradox of their situation lay in its restraint. They had prepared for brutality and found procedure. They had anticipated hatred and encountered professionalism. This did not bring comfort. Instead, It eroded the simple narratives they had carried with them into captivity. The enemy, it seemed, was not behaving as expected. And in that dissonance, something more troubling began to surface. A recognition that the reckoning they feared might not come in the form they had imagined. Outside the camps, the world moved forward. Reconstruction plans were drafted. Trials were announced. New borders were drawn on maps by hands far removed from the wire and watchtowers. Inside, time stretched. The generals waited, suspended between past authority and an uncertain future, surrounded by a system that neither condemned nor absolved them outright. It was within this quiet, procedural space that the true tension of their captivity took shape. Not in acts of violence or open confrontation, but in the slow erosion of certainty. The war had ended loudly, but its aftermath unfolded in silence. And in that silence, among men trained to command and to obey, a different kind of reckoning began. One that offered no clear verdict, only the unsettling possibility that restraint itself might be the most disarming force of all. The days settled into a rhythm that was neither punishment nor freedom. At first, the German officers marked time instinctively as they had always done, by the habits of command. Morning inspections, measured walks, careful observance of hierarchy even in captivity. The American guards, many of them scarcely trained for this kind of custodial duty, watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The prisoners rose early, stood in loose formations and addressed one another by rank, as if the rituals themselves might preserve a fragment of the order that had governed their lives. The war had ended, yet discipline lingered like an echo that refused to fade. Meals arrived on schedule. The food was simple: bread, soup, occasional meat, coffee that tasted more of boiled grain than beans. It was not generous, but it was steady. For men who had expected hunger, this regularity unsettled them. Some ate cautiously at first, suspicious of the portions, uncertain whether abundance concealed some intention. Others ate quickly, almost defiantly, as if daring the routine to break. In private journals, several wrote that the predictability of meals was more disturbing than deprivation would have been. It forced them to confront a strange reality: their captors were not seeking revenge. The camps themselves were not uniform. Some were enclosed by barbed wire and guard towers, others by little more than fences and patrols. Yet all shared a similar atmosphere: orderly, restrained, and curiously quiet. There were no triumphant speeches from the guards, no shouted accusations. The Americans addressed the prisoners with clipped formality, often using ranks that technically no longer existed. This courtesy, extended without warmth, left the generals uncertain how to respond. They were accustomed to obedience enforced through fear or loyalty, not through procedural neutrality. Conversations among the prisoners often circled back to expectation. What would come next? Trials? Transfers? Indefinite detention? Rumors spread quickly, fed by fragments of overheard conversation or misinterpreted gestures. One officer claimed to have seen lists being prepared. Another insisted that the Americans were merely waiting for political directives. The absence of clear information created its own tension. The men filled the silence with speculation, with memories, with arguments over responsibility and fate. In the evenings after the final count, the camps grew still. Lights dimmed early. The sounds of the day receded, replaced by the faint rustle of clothing, the scraping of boots on wooden floors, the occasional cough. It was in these hours that reflection became unavoidable. Many of the officers had spent their lives issuing orders, rarely forced to dwell on consequence. Now, with nothing but time, they replayed moments long buried beneath the momentum of war. Some found themselves recalling minor decisions rather than grand strategies: a sentence spoken in haste, an order signed without thought. Others retreated into silence, as if silence itself might shield them from memory. The guards observed these changes without comment. Their role required distance, yet proximity made detachment difficult. They saw men who had once commanded armies struggle with idleness. They noted the careful way prisoners folded blankets, polished boots that would never march again, maintained routines long stripped of purpose. In letters home, some guards described the experience as unsettling. These were not the monsters of propaganda, nor were they sympathetic figures. They were simply men reduced and waiting. Occasionally, a guard would exchange a few words with a prisoner, about the weather, about the length of the day, about a shared discomfort. These brief interactions, mundane and unremarkable, carried a quiet weight. They blurred the rigid line between victor and defeated. The Americans were instructed not to fraternize, yet complete detachment proved impossible. Proximity eroded absolutes. Familiarity crept in through repetition. The generals, for their part, struggled to interpret this behavior. Some suspected it was a tactic, a calculated effort to unsettle them by denying the clarity of hostility. Others wondered whether the war, as they had understood it, had truly ended in the way they believed. If the enemy did not act as an enemy, what did that imply about the conflict itself? Such questions were rarely spoken aloud, but they lingered, unformed and persistent. Time passed unevenly. Days felt long, yet weeks vanished without clear markers. The men learned the rhythms of the camp as one learns the sound of a river, present, constant, impossible to ignore. Occasional announcements hinted at upcoming transfers or interrogations, but specifics remained elusive. The uncertainty weighed heavily. It was easier, some admitted, to face punishment than to exist in suspension. Among the officers were men of varying temperaments. Some clung fiercely to their former identities, insisting on protocol and decorum even when it served no purpose. Others withdrew inward, speaking little, observing everything. A few began to show signs of erosion, sleep disturbed, tempers shortened, moments of uncharacteristic vulnerability. The absence of clear judgment gnawed at them. They had prepared themselves for condemnation, even for death. What they encountered instead was a prolonged waiting that offered no release. From the perspective of the American command, the situation was equally complex. There were expectations from above to adhere strictly to international standards, to demonstrate restraint and legality in contrast to the enemy's conduct. There was also the practical challenge of managing thousands of high-ranking prisoners whose very presence carried symbolic weight. Every interaction was, in some sense, a performance, for superiors, for future scrutiny, for history itself. The camps became spaces where power was exercised quietly, almost invisibly. Control was maintained not through force but through structure. Schedules replaced chains. Paperwork replaced punishment. The system functioned with an efficiency that left little room for emotional expression. Yet beneath this orderly surface the psychological impact deepened. For the prisoners, the absence of overt hostility forced an inward reckoning. For the guards, the act of restraint demanded constant vigilance against impulse. Occasionally, news from outside penetrated the camp. Reports of trials beginning elsewhere, of public reckonings, of nations trying to articulate responsibility for the devastation left behind. These fragments of information sharpened the tension. The generals listened carefully, parsing every detail for clues about their own fate. Each report raised questions rather than answering them. Would justice be personal or collective? Swift or prolonged? Public or private? As weeks turned into months, the initial shock of capture gave way to a deeper, more enduring unease. The men were no longer reacting, they were waiting. Waiting for summons, for transfer, for judgment. Waiting became a state of being. In that state, the certainty they had once known, of rank, of purpose, of moral clarity, began to erode. The camp did not strip them of identity through brutality. It did so through stillness. The American guards, too, felt the weight of this prolonged ambiguity. Some later recalled a growing discomfort with their role as custodians of men who were neither convicted nor absolved. They enforced rules, but they also witnessed the quiet unraveling of those in their charge. The experience left impressions that lingered long after their service ended, shaping how they remembered victory itself. By the time formal proceedings loomed on the horizon, the psychological landscape had already shifted. Whatever judgments awaited, they would arrive after a long period of enforced contemplation. The prisoners had been given time to remember, to rationalize, to doubt. Time to confront not only what they had done, but what had been done to them in return. In this suspended world, where punishment was delayed and mercy was ambiguous, the central tension remained unresolved. The camps had not delivered closure. They had offered something quieter and more unsettling, a prolonged encounter with uncertainty, in which authority was stripped of its drama and replaced by routine. And in that routine, both captors and captives found themselves changed, though neither could yet say how or to what end. In the years that followed, the camps emptied without ceremony. There were no final assemblies, no speeches to mark the moment when the last prisoner stepped beyond the wire. The departures were quiet, almost administrative. Names were called. Papers were signed. Men who had once commanded armies gathered their few belongings and walked away under the indifferent gaze of clerks and guards who had long since learned not to look too closely. The gates closed behind them, not with finality, but with the dull certainty of a task completed. For some, release meant return, to cities in ruins, to families dispersed or lost, to a nation reshaped by defeat and occupation. For others, it meant only transfer, another phase of uncertainty carried out under different authority. But wherever they went, the memory of captivity followed, not as a single image but as a series of sensations. The measured sound of footsteps during roll call, the smell of boiled food drifting through narrow corridors, the quiet weight of evenings spent in enforced reflection. These impressions did not fade easily. They attached themselves to the years that followed, resurfacing without warning. Those who spoke later, in memoirs or interviews, often struggled to explain what had unsettled them most. It was not cruelty, they said. Not hunger or physical suffering. It was something harder to name. A sense of being watched without being threatened. Of being controlled without being broken. The experience resisted simple language. It did not fit the expected narrative of victor and vanquished, nor did it align with the stories of brutality that dominated public memory of the war. In private, some admitted that the restraint shown by their captors had forced an unwelcome confrontation with themselves. Deprived of the familiar framework of command and obedience, they were left with time to reconsider decisions once justified by duty or necessity. The absence of overt punishment removed the refuge of martyrdom. There was no dramatic suffering to cling to, no clear enemy against whom to harden resolve. Instead, there was the slow pressure of reflection, the steady erosion of certainty. The guards, too, carried their own version of the experience. Many returned home with stories they found difficult to tell. Friends and family expected tales of victory or danger, of righteous triumph over a defeated foe. What they offered instead were fragmented recollections, long hours of monotony, conversations that skirted forbidden topics, the uneasy awareness of guarding men who, in another context, might have been respected or feared. The moral clarity promised by wartime rhetoric proved elusive in the quiet aftermath. As years passed, official histories began to take shape. Trials were documented, verdicts recorded, sentences handed down. The narrative solidified around legal judgments and political outcomes. Yet beneath these formal accounts lay a quieter history, composed of moments that resisted categorization. The camps where restraint replaced retribution rarely occupied more than a footnote. They did not fit easily into stories of justice served or crimes punished. They were ambiguous spaces, and ambiguity has a way of being smoothed out over time. Those who lived through that period often spoke less as the years went on. Memory, worn by repetition or avoidance, softened its edges. Some details faded, others sharpened unexpectedly. A particular morning light. The sound of a key turning in a lock. The feeling of standing in a line, aware of being observed but not judged. These fragments endured, detached from any clear moral frame. In later decades, when scholars and journalists sought to reconstruct the past, they encountered these fragments like scattered pieces of an incomplete record. Official documents spoke of compliance with international law, of orderly detention, of humane treatment. Personal accounts, when they surfaced, complicated that picture without fully contradicting it. They suggested that the most profound effects of captivity were not always visible, that restraint could wound as deeply as cruelty, though in quieter ways. The men who had once waited behind wire grew old. Some spoke candidly in their final years, others not at all. A few attempted to explain what it had meant to be treated with restraint by an enemy they had been taught to dehumanize. Their words were often hesitant, marked by long pauses and unfinished thoughts. It was as if language itself faltered in the face of experiences that defied familiar categories of guilt and punishment. In the broader public memory, the camps faded into the background of a larger narrative of war and recovery. They became footnotes, references in scholarly works, or passing mentions in biographies. The complexity of those months, of men waiting in uncertainty, of power exercised through order rather than violence, was rarely explored. It was easier to remember clear lines than blurred ones, easier to recount triumph than restraint. Yet the quiet legacy of those places persisted. It lingered in the way former prisoners spoke of authority, in the way some former guards understood obedience. It influenced how a generation thought about power exercised without spectacle, about control maintained through structure rather than fear. These were lessons not easily articulated, and perhaps not fully understood even by those who lived them. In the end, what remained was not a story of redemption or condemnation, but of disquiet. The camps stood as reminders that the aftermath of war does not always announce itself with finality. Sometimes it unfolds in silence, in routines that continue long after the fighting stops. Sometimes it leaves behind not closure, but a question that resists resolution. What did it mean, in the wake of devastation, to be treated with restraint rather than vengeance? And what does it say about victory when its most enduring mark is not triumph, but an unsettled memory that refuses to fade?